Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Listeners, I have a treat for you all today as my next guest is Tricia Stringer, a much-loved best-selling Australian author of a whopping 17 novels. A multi-award-winning author, Tricia's novels include Back on Track, Keeping Up Appearances, Birds of a Feather, The Model Wife and Table for Eight, along with 7 rural romances and an historical saga. Growing up on a farm in country South Australia, Tricia has spent most of her life in rural communities, owning a post office and bookshop, then later working as a teacher and librarian, and infuses all of her books with the practical knowledge, warmth, and gentle humour typical of our rural communities. And I'm simply delighted to have the chance to speak with Tricia this morning about her terrific new novel, Head for the Hills. Welcome, Tricia, and congratulations on novel number 17.
Thank you so much, Claudine. It's just lovely to be talking to you. I'm very excited that Head for the Hills is out now.
Indeed, and it's been a hot minute since the book was released. But I wanted to ask you, what's the kind of feedback that you're getting on this book so far?
I've been hearing from readers already, and I, always go, hey, do you know how long it took me to write that book? Slow down. But I think some of them have had advanced copies too, but it's been very positive. Lots of great feedback, which is great.
Tricia, you and I spoke a little bit before I started recording, but in preparing for our chat today, I went back into my archives and to my utter surprise, learned that it's been nearly 6 years to the day that we last recorded a podcast chat. In fact, I believe you were one of my earliest guests after I started this podcast. It's so incredible how fast time flies, isn't it?
It sure is. I do remember that very first podcast with you, sitting in a bedroom at my son's place because I was staying in Brisbane at the time and thinking, I've not done one of these before. I'm not sure what to do. It didn't hurt a bit.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. As I said to you, in the intervening time, you've gone on to write another 6 novels, which is just incredible to me. So amazing, because that's prolific by anyone's standards. So I guess I wanted to chat in the first instance about your long-standing writing career and how you maintain that longevity and professional drive to keep pumping out a book every year.
I think this year, probably all of the things I've said in the past have fallen over. I'm usually fairly organised and, it's all well planned out. But this year we've built a house, moved twice. My husband's had a hip replacement and all of the usual things that stand me in good stead for getting my book organised have gone out the window a little bit. But in general, it's more that there are so many good ideas always floating around. People sort of say, where do you get your ideas from? And I get them from anywhere. Reading things, listening to things, talking to people, there's always something. And it's always just a spark of an idea that then leads me to another story. And so that happens to me all the time. So I'm always excited about the next story and then, sitting down and writing it. That's the hard part, of course. But you just have to be disciplined to its work, and you've got to get that first draft down, and then after that you can play with it all you like, but it's getting that first draft down that's the task. And for me this year that's just been a little bit interrupted, but normally I would just get that done. It takes a good part of the year to do.
Indeed. And so what would your typical writing day look like?
When I first started writing, I was working full-time as a teacher librarian, so I was snatching little tiny bits of writing wherever I could. So when I resigned from that job to take up full-time writing, suddenly I found I had all day to write, and I am a procrastinator. So I would get to the end of the day and think, what have I done today? Pretty much nothing as far as getting words on the page. So what I decided was, I thought about it long and hard. How can I make this work better? So what I decided was I would pretend like I'm going out to work, do the sorts of things that I would do before I went to school every day. So, a few jobs around the house, have your breakfast, get organised, do whatever it is you have to do. And then I would take myself into my office and I'm at work, and I try to put that headset on that I'm at work. And I take breaks obviously, and sometimes when things aren't working right, I might go down for a walk on the beach or something like that, but I can't be interrupted because I'm at work. So I have to do this, so that's, I guess, a discipline that you have to enforce on yourself. No one else is going to do it.
Tricia, the stats that I saw suggested that you have sold in excess of 250,000 books and that you're one of Australia's top 25 fiction authors. Congratulations. That's amazing. And I guess it kind of got me wondering, is that something that you think about or feel pressured by when you're coming up with ideas or working on your new novel? Is this something that ever you worry about?
No, is the short answer. I only found out I was in the top 25 earlier this year, and that was just such a thrill to hear. Wow. I just think of all the writers that we have, and I think, how can I be in the top 25? I can't believe it. But evidently Nielsen Bookscan takes all those things into account, and yes, I am. So deep breath moment, but that's not what I think about when I'm writing, obviously. I am just deep in the next book, writing those characters, getting to know them, spending time with them, writing their story. And so that's what I'm thinking about. How am I going to bring these characters to life for my readers? I think about my readers a lot, probably more than I maybe did when I first started out. When I first started writing, I was probably writing for myself more. Now, because I do have a readership and I know that they like my type of book, then I know there's an expectation that that's the style of book I will write. And I love it. So, while I still love it, I'll just keep writing it.
Yeah, and thinking about your readers, I have noticed on your socials you have an incredible following. You pump out newsletters as well as posting regularly on socials. Is that something that you are conscious of and deliberate about in terms of keeping connected with your readers in between books?
Most definitely. For me, because I'm at home working away, it's lovely for me because I've got that connection. Whereas, you normally don't see readers unless you're out on tour or doing a book talk or whatever. So it's lovely to have that connection. But I think it's also nice for them. It's a two-way street. After my newsletters go out, I often get messages from people just saying how much they enjoyed them, or they tried that recipe, or they, grew that rose too, or whatever it is that we talk about. I love that interaction with readers, and it's so nice. Yeah, makes it just that little bit more personal. And
I do love reading your newsletters myself and was very interested to know that you bake using your Thermomix as I do.
yes, I do love my Thermomix. I'm a lazy cook, I think. And so when I found out about Thermomixes, I thought, yes.
You mentioned earlier that you get ideas from all sorts of places. So, thinking about Head for the Hills, I wondered if you could tell me what or who inspired this story.
This story is about a big development coming to a small community. And I mean, I'm sure, it's all around Australia, but in particular in South Australia, of course, I hear about things here. In more recent times, there's been mining. There's been proposed mines, there's been wind farms, radioactive waste storage, hotel developments, all of those sorts of things. And they're proposed in quite small communities and what we like to think of as pristine communities too, or areas where it's the food belt, where beautiful food that we pride ourselves in is being grown. And do we want a mine right in the middle of all of that? So those sorts of things have been happening and I've been just reading about it. And so I just really thought, what would happen in a small community if a proposed development came along? And that was kind of the little spark that got Head for the Hills going.
Yeah, fantastic. I think there's so much to unpack in this book, so many themes, which I think, as you alluded to, aren't only relevant to small town, rural, or regional communities. But before we delve into that, for the benefit of listeners who may not have read the book, I wondered if you could tell me more about it.
The story is set in a fictitious town in the Adelaide Hills, and small community, close knit, good community spirit and so on. And the sale of a deceased estate opens up a parcel of beautiful land, which has lovely old vines, grapevines on it, and the possibility that a boutique hotel could be built there. People start to talk about that. And of course, as with any argument, there are always pros and cons. So, discussions become, a bit heated, and neighbours start to argue with neighbours, friends with friends. And two sisters who've lived in this community all their lives and actually live side by side and will be right beside the development find themselves both literally and figuratively on opposite sides of the fence. So that's it in a nutshell.
Fantastic. And you mentioned Jesserton, the fictional town that you've set it in. Was it modelled on any particular town in the Adelaide Hills, or was it more of a mishmash of towns?
It was a mishmash. In the back of the book, I've put front and centre, please don't go driving around the Adelaide Hills looking for Jesserton, because you won't find it. I do name a couple of bigger places in the hills, obviously, but no, Jesserton was just a mixture of all the lovely things that I saw. I have a son that lives in the Adelaide Hills, so when we go and visit, obviously we go different places, to wineries, to eateries, to, all the lovely places that you can go in the hills. Yeah, I just took little bits of this one and little bits of that one and put them all together to make Jesserton.
Felt so authentic to me. And I say that because earlier this year, I was fortunate to visit Adelaide and then ventured into the Adelaide Hills and was incredibly impressed by the small towns, the local businesses, bespoke industries that obviously include wineries and cafes and so on. But in saying that, progress and development in the context of such small communities, I imagine, could be fraught with so many competing opinions and interests, lots of which you kind of like alluded to in this book. As a rural resident for so many years, you must have seen a fair amount of these kinds of proposals and this kind of community division, would you say?
Definitely. We love our small communities. The things that we love about them, of course, is what attracts visitors, tourism, and then we build on that in that we have more cafes and all of those sorts of things that are fun to have in a community, but we have to share them. Of course, they wouldn't survive without tourists. So then you have to have the infrastructure that you need to provide accommodation and services, etc., for extra people who come into your area. So it's kind of that catch-22 of wanting to keep your uniqueness and the small town vibe, but also we like to have the extra things that come with extra people coming along. So it's always going to divide people about, how they feel about whatever that development might be, whether it's accommodation or something else that comes along that people have different opinions about.
Yeah, I guess I've been thinking a lot about responsibility in tourism as somebody who does like to travel, and the impact and the footprint that being a tourist and creating demand in places that don't have the infrastructure to cope with big tourist influxes and the environmental damage that we're doing. Is that something that you think about or were thinking about when you were writing this novel?
I think during COVID, we saw a lot of that, because we were confined to our own states in a lot of ways. And so people wanted to travel, and so they would do it within their own state. And then they were going to places that couldn't cope, especially South Australia. Our rural areas are very isolated and tiny. So they don't have, rubbish points at every lovely scenic outlook and, all of those sorts of things, or where people were camping, nowhere to, to put all the things that went with camping. So, those sorts of things happened a lot in COVID. The good side of it is perhaps local councils stepped up a little bit more and thought, okay, we need to do something about making pathways so people don't walk through bushland, and fences so they don't drop off cliffs, rubbish points and things like that. So maybe that was a good thing. But at the same time, I think as a tourist, yeah, you do have to be aware, and it doesn't matter where you go. You're in someone else's backyard. So whether it's city, country, or overseas, wherever you are. So yeah, I think you do have to be a responsible tourist in as much as you can. Yeah.
Yeah, so well said. Tricia, the other thing that I was touched by in this book was the plight of single mother to be Amber and the struggle that she faces in trying to find decent accommodation in the town of Jesserton.
Yeah.
This is something that is troubling many cities and towns across Australia at the moment during this unprecedented housing crisis that we're seeing. I wondered if you could talk to that and how Amber's situation highlighted this fundamental problem.
Yes, Amber is such an interesting character. And do you know, I didn't know her. I like to know my main characters before I start writing. So I knew a lot about Rosalind and Margot.
Mm.
And Amber was this tiny walk, if you can imagine it as a play, she had a tiny walk-in part, didn't even have any dialogue. At the very start of the book, she was just an extra person in a doctor's surgery. And suddenly, and I've heard other authors say it too, and it's happened to me before, that tap on the shoulder of this character wanting a voice. And I thought, well, who are you? So I did some more, research. And around that time, I did see an article about an organisation who particularly focused on women of Amber's age and stage because they were some of the hardest to find housing for, because they either lived at home or with a partner, so they had no bill history. They'd not paid bills in their name, sort of thing, and they didn't have any rental history and all that sort of stuff. And that's really that's just another stumbling point. And sometimes, they didn't even know how to look after themselves very well. If they had food, how did they cook it, and all of those sorts of things, because they hadn't been taught it. And so this particular organisation, which I can't remember their names, it was just a wonderful group that found sort of halfway accommodation for these women while they trained them up, gave them some experiences, and also helped them with background to get accommodation. And so that really helped me understand Amber's character much, much more than I could see how she could easily be in the situation she was in, which was living in her car.
Putting that in the context of the growing demographic of older Australian women who are finding themselves homeless as well, I think paints a dire picture of our social structures that sees women, vulnerable women, falling through the cracks in this way. And I think some of the really amazing parts of your book was showing the things like Amber trying to find accommodation and being 15th in queue to
Mm.
inspect this rundown hovel of a place that nobody would, want to live in necessarily. And then obviously, as you say, not having any bill history, not having any rental history, and having a very uncertain income stream, and also expecting a baby, just putting her in an extremely vulnerable state. I just honestly, my heart just went out to that poor girl.
Mine too. And I was so glad I got to know her because she had some inner strengths she didn't know she had. And the beauty of it was that in her own way, Rosalind was able to support that, which, I just thought that was once again, I didn't see that coming when I was starting to write that story. And those two together worked out really well.
And the other thing that brought up for me, this particular situation, because Rosalind in the book starts thinking about Amber's situation and starts thinking about people that have, granny flats in their backyards and putting those empty places to better use. It got me starting to think about the arguments that people are putting forward to this fundamental right of people to have a roof over their heads. And, we have a lot of empty houses across Australia, people that are using houses infrequently as their holiday homes and whatnot, and taking that stock off the permanent rental market. This was such a timely discussion in the book to address maybe some of the issues and worries around this.
Definitely. And I think, that's another thing about living where I do, is that I am surrounded by holiday houses that are empty for part of the year. And whilst, people have a right to have those houses, at the same time, part of me thinks, oh, but, how many people could we house? I mean, I've got a caravan in my yard. And I think, somebody could be living in that caravan, but it's not as easy as just say, yeah, come and live in that caravan. There are laws against it, so you can't just live in someone's caravan in their backyard. There's a lot to sort of unpack there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I were recently at the Northern Beaches Readers Festival, a fabulous festival celebrating genre fiction at its best in beautiful Avalon. And you appeared on a panel talking about 50 plus women represented in fiction. And well, apart from a few characters in Head for the Hills, many of your characters, indeed the two main characters, Rosalind and Margot were mature women. So I wanted to ask you, Tricia, are you deliberate in your decision or desire to write about women in this demographic, or is it just the characters that come to you and the story that you want to tell?
Definitely deliberate, but also about the stories I want to tell because, the two go hand in hand. I started writing rural romance, which I really enjoyed, but I found even in those stories, the younger people were probably the main characters, but I always had older people in their lives. And so I kind of slowly have made this switch to the focus being on, the more senior people in the story, and then there's still younger ones in the story as well. Yeah, there are just so many things that affect our lives at any age and stage. And I just obviously am interested in the things around my age group. And I love reading about that. And I found it hard to find books that had heroines who were over 50. So yeah, I thought, well, I'm going to write them, see how it goes.
I'm loving seeing this, rising popularity of books that are featuring women in the 50 plus age category, because I think the kinds of issues that women in our age group are dealing with are far different from what other age groups are experiencing.
And that's life, isn't it? We're all going through different things, and we like to, I think, read about those things to just sort of help put ourselves in context, and or try walking in someone else's shoes, or to get that different perspective and think, yeah, that happened to me, and yeah, I can sort of understand how that might be. So I think, yeah, it's important that we have books representing everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's talk about Margot and Rosalind, who, as you say, are sisters and who've lived next door to each other for most of their lives. And I think Margot in particular, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Margot in particular is really struggling with her identity in many ways and suffering the dreaded invisibility syndrome. Do you think that's true of Margot?
Yes, it is. Margot, I think, is trying to please everyone. She's obviously very family orientated. And one of the ways she expresses that support for her family is obviously through her cooking. And she, likes to cater for everyone's needs. She runs a business part-time, and she supports her husband's business. So she's trying to do so much, but also a softer person, like things perhaps said to her or done to her, she doesn't want to upset whoever might have done that, but they fester in her. So she kind of keeps things close in, and then they, instead of sort of getting them off her chest, things come out later that she perhaps didn't intend.
Indeed. And she has, I would say, a difficult relationship with Rosalind throughout the events of this book. As you say, they sort of literally and figuratively find themselves on opposite sides of the fence of this proposed development. And I think you've done a really wonderful job of showing the nuances and flaws and difficulties of sibling relationships in this book. We've got Margot and Rosalind, but also we've got Nick and Emily. So I kind of wanted to know, if this was something you were particularly keen to explore in this novel.
Oh, look, sibling relationships are always interesting, aren't they? And for everyone, so different. In fact, you asked me about comments, and that just reminded me of one that I did get from someone that said she loved that sibling relationship and the back and forth, etc., and how it worked out. And she said it was so similar to my own experience. However, for me, it didn't work out. And I thought, oh, you want everybody to be in a book and have perhaps a happy for now ending, don't you? But yeah, sibling relationships are fraught. We're all different. I have a brother, and well, my sister has died, but my brother is 10 years older than me. My sister was 12 years older than me. So I was the baby of the family, the spoilt one, the one that got everything, all of that sort of stuff. So I'm used to that sort of thing. And then I have 3 children, they're closer together. So, I see the oldest, the middle child, the youngest, all of those different ways that they interact. And of course, people all around you in their own relationships. So yeah, it was fun to explore that sibling relationship and how it might work for Rosalind and Margot.
I absolutely loved that. And interestingly, saw some characteristics that my own children display, even in Emily and Nick's relationship. they're very acutely aware of what each one gets and, very concerned about it being fair, being seen
Yes.
to be fair, if not actually fair.
They're adults themselves, but they're still even though they've left home, they're still grappling for their parents' attention in so many ways. Yeah.
The other thing that was really interesting for me, you've tapped into the pulse of what's happening across Australia at the moment, where everything is a lot harder for our kids. The current generation, everything is a lot harder. Buying a house is a lot harder. Starting a business is a lot harder. And a lot of kids do rely on the bank of mum and dad to help them out as interest rates are high. And so everybody wants to stay away from that.
It is tricky. My kids are that bit older. They've managed, thankfully. I mean, I guess we did what we could to support them, but they've done it pretty much on their own. And yeah, they've been, lucky maybe, but it isn't easy for, generation now trying to put a roof over their head and all that sort of thing.
So, in the writing of this novel, Tricia, was there any research that you did in particular that you could share with us, or anything in your research that
Oh,
surprised you?
yes. Oh, councils. Oh my goodness. And planning. Councils and planning and state planning. I have no idea what it is in other states, but obviously I just was setting my story in South Australia, so I focused on that. And in the end, what I decided was that even though there are rules and regulations that everyone is supposed to follow, they can be moved and squidged and bent and shifted a little bit per council. And so I decided that I would just write my story and rapidly follow the rules. But by golly, it was tricky. And in the end, I realised I still knew nothing about all of the research that I'd done. I spent a lot of time researching and I just still didn't. I spoke to some mayors, I spoke to some council employees, planning officers, who gave me some wonderful feedback and some insights. But yeah, it still was different depending on where you were. So I thought, oh, well, Jesserton is a made-up town, so it's in a made-up council. So yeah, the planning stuff was quite intriguing.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I have also tried to research local planning laws, and it's honestly so difficult to understand.
It depends what you're doing, depends if you're a developer or a private person, and the terminology and who's allowed to do what. It's just fascinating. You could get lost down a rabbit hole, which I did on many occasions. And as I said, in the end, I just thought, oh, look, I'm just going to do it my way. And hopefully not too many actual planning officers will read my book.
If there was one thing you would like readers to take away from your book, what would that be?
I hope that readers would perhaps relate to the different characters and maybe have that experience of walking in someone else's shoes to, experience some empathy for someone who might be living in quite a different life to the life that you're living. And what I hope for my readers is that they maybe learn something along the way, maybe experience that empathy, but also that they can just get lost in a story that they can relax with and enjoy. And at the end of it, just sort of sit back and think, well, I really enjoyed those characters. I had fun with them. And yeah, it was a jolly good read.
And so, to that end, Tricia, I actually really hate asking this question, but I feel like it might be something you want to share with listeners. But are you working on something else at the moment?
Most definitely, I'm working on something else. It is not as completed as it should be at this time of year, which is sort of when I'm usually handing it over to my publisher, but it's well underway. And yes, so it's something a bit different. It's about two couples who set off together on a trip of a lifetime, and before they're too far up the road, of course, there's a few cracks in their relationships and things go a little awry, and their travels along the way may not work out exactly as they had planned.
Tricia, I wondered, given our discussions earlier about longevity, your career as a writer, I wondered if you had any tips to offer aspiring authors who listen to this podcast.
I think if you are writing, it's one of those things that it's a bit cliche, but you just write as often as you can. When I started out, I was working full time and writing. I had children at home, all of the things. And so writing was something I did in little snippets, but I did make sure that I did that. I earmarked this time is for me, and I would write. So I think that's really important, because the more you write, the better you get at it, obviously, and that's really important. The other thing that I would say is never give up on your goal or your dream, because you just never know. You just never know. And if you're not writing, then no one's going to say, I want to read what you're writing, because you're not writing it. So I think it's so important that even in the downest times, if you can find something that will keep you writing, hang on to that thing. For me, just sometimes out of the blue, it would just be a message from someone who said, I just read that and I really enjoyed it. And, I'd think, oh, nobody's reading my stuff. And, then suddenly you get this message and you think, oh, yes, that's a reason to keep going. But, for me, I just love it. It's just something that's in me. It's an itch that I have to keep scratching. So I just am so into the writing life that I just like to keep doing it. Yeah, practice it. Don't give up. And immerse yourself with other writers, like Northern Beaches Readers Festival. What a wonderful way to do that. Belong to a writing group of some sort. If you live in the country like I do, you have to belong to online groups. That's okay too. Just find people that you can talk to about writing, because, your family get a bit sick of it after a while. So yeah, it's lovely to be with other writers who know what you're talking about at any stage. I think the Australian writing community is so welcoming, and it doesn't matter if you are just starting out and not sure what you're doing, or whether you've been writing for a long, long time. People are always, so welcoming. Once again, harking back to the Readers Festival last weekend, that was just so in the room. The love was in the room, wasn't it? It was just such a great festival.
I love that, Tricia. You were talking about community and finding like-minded people. And to that extent, how important is organisations like Romance Writers of Australia to your journey or to aspiring authors?
Yes, definitely. Romance Writers of Australia has been a wonderful support for me, and is one that I always recommend to people, because it doesn't matter if you're a romance writer or a crime writer or whatever it is you write. They are such a supportive community who offer writing techniques and courses, etc., which you can apply to any kind of writing. So, that's a great organisation. The other ones that I recommend are your state writing, essay writers for me, but whatever your state writing group is. I used to belong to New South Wales one back in the early days, because they had a fantastic magazine and it was always full of really good writing tips. So I used to devour that. If you've got a local group, you're very lucky. If you've got one that you can go to and meet up with, and, I know you guys have got a lovely little group that you keep, I'm very envious of, because it's a little bit further for me to go to reach my writing friends. They're a bit further afield. But anyway, anything like that, I think, is very important. And you find the one that suits you and, yeah, go with it.
Tricia, I absolutely loved Head for the Hills. It's a perfect Christmas gift for a friend or a loved one, and I can't wait to see what comes next. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.